Every empire that ever conquered the Jewish people is gone. Babylon, which carried them into exile in 586 BCE, does not exist. The Assyrian Empire that destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel is dust. Rome, which burned the Second Temple and scattered its population across 3 continents, fell. The Byzantine Empire that restricted Jewish life for centuries collapsed. The Crusader states, the Almohad Caliphate, the Spanish Empire that expelled its Jewish population in 1492, the Tsarist Russia that organized systematic violence against Jewish communities, the Third Reich that attempted to eliminate them entirely. All of these are history. The Jewish people are not. That is not a feel-good observation. It is one of the most historically unusual facts in the entire record of human civilization. No other people of comparable antiquity, after losing their political center, their temple, their land, and facing repeated organized attempts at their destruction, maintained a coherent, recognizable, textually continuous identity across 2.5 millennia. The question that drives this story is not simply how they survived. It is what kind of survival it was, what it cost, and what it reveals about how human communities actually hold together when everything external that normally defines a nation, land, state, army, capital is taken away. If that question interests you, consider subscribing. This channel covers history as it actually happened, not as it is simplified for comfort. To understand the Jewish story, you have to begin not with persecution, but with what existed before the catastrophe, because the catastrophe only becomes comprehensible when you understand what was lost and what, remarkably, was not. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Israelites were a collection of tribal confederacies occupying a narrow, strategically awkward strip of land between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan River. The region sits at a geographic crossroads, the land bridge between the great civilizations of Mesopotamia to the northeast and Egypt to the southwest. Every army that moved between those 2 poles passed through or near this territory. The Israelites did not choose a quiet corner of the ancient world. They built their identity in one of its most contested corridors. The political history of this period is complex, and in many of its details, still debated by historians and archaeologists. What the archaeological record and the biblical text together suggest is a society that moved from a loose tribal structure toward a more centralized monarchy, reaching its symbolic peak under figures like David and Solomon in roughly the 10th century BCE. The unified kingdom, if it existed in the form later texts describe, did not last long. It split into 2 distinct political entities, the northern kingdom of Israel, centered on Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, centered on Jerusalem. This division matters enormously. It is not just political trivia. The northern kingdom was larger, wealthier, and more integrated into the broader trade networks of the ancient Near East. It was also more religiously diverse, more politically unstable, and ultimately more vulnerable. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire under Sargon II destroyed Samaria and deported a significant portion of its population, the so-called 10 lost tribes, into the interior of the Assyrian Empire, where they were absorbed and effectively disappeared from history. This is a crucial and often underappreciated point. Assimilation into a conquering empire was the normal outcome for a defeated ancient people. It happened to the northern Israelites. It happened to dozens of other peoples across the ancient world. The fact that it did not happen to the southern kingdom of Judah, at least not completely, is the beginning of the story. The southern kingdom survived the Assyrian period, partly through diplomacy, partly through geography, and partly through what historians describe as a period of intense religious and textual consolidation. The reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE is particularly significant in this regard. Josiah undertook what the biblical text describes as a sweeping religious reform, centralizing worship in Jerusalem, suppressing local shrines and religious practices, and critically associated with the discovery or composition of a major legal text, most likely an early version of what became the Book of Deuteronomy. Whatever one makes of the theological claims involved, the historical effect is clear. The written text began to function as a portable identity anchor. You did not need the shrine on the hill, you needed the scroll. That shift, from a religion of place to a religion of text, would prove to be one of the most consequential institutional innovations in the history of human civilization. But its importance only became fully visible when the next catastrophe arrived. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem. The temple, the central sacred site of Israelite religion, the physical dwelling place of the divine presence according to the theology of the time, was burned. The walls of the city were torn down. The royal family, the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, the administrative elite, the entire leadership class of Judah were deported to Babylon. This was not a minor setback. By every precedent available in the ancient world, it should have been the end. The logic of ancient conquest was straightforward. You destroy the center, you remove the leadership, you relocate the population, you install your own administrative structure, and within a generation or two, the conquered people have been absorbed. Their gods have been shown to be weaker than your gods. Their identity dissolves into the larger imperial culture. This is what happened to virtually every other people the Babylonians and Assyrians conquered. It did not happen to the Judeans. In Babylon, something extraordinary occurred. The exiled community, and historians estimate the deportation included somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, primarily from the elite, did not dissolve. They gathered, they wrote, they remembered, they argued, they compiled. The Babylonian exile is now understood by most biblical scholars as the period in which a vast amount of the Hebrew Bible reached something close to its current written form. The priests and scribes who had lost their temple did not abandon their theology. They transformed it. If God had allowed this destruction, there must be a reason. The reason they developed, that the exile was a consequence of the people's failure to live according to the covenant, was theologically painful but institutionally brilliant. It meant the catastrophe was not evidence that God had been defeated. It was evidence that the relationship between God and the people was real, demanding, and still operative. This reinterpretation is not a minor theological footnote. It is the mechanism by which an ancient Near Eastern tribal religion survived the destruction of its physical center and became something genuinely new, a portable, text-based, community-centered identity that did not require a temple, a king, or a homeland to function. Then, in 539 BCE, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. And Cyrus did something that was, by ancient standards, unusual. He issued a decree. The Cyrus Cylinder records a version of it, though the precise text concerning the Jews appears in the biblical book of Ezra, allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Judeans were permitted to return. Some did, many did not. This is the first great fork in Jewish history, and it is rarely given the weight it deserves. When Cyrus issued his decree, the Jewish community had been in Babylon for roughly 50 years. A generation had grown up there. They spoke Aramaic. They had built houses, established businesses, formed community networks. When the option to return was offered, a significant portion of the community chose to stay, not because they were forced to, because Babylon had become home. This voluntary diaspora, the decision to remain outside the land even when return was possible, established a pattern that would define Jewish history for the next 2.5 millennia. There would always be a community in the land of Israel, and there would always be communities outside it. These communities would be in constant tension, constant dialogue, and constant mutual dependence. Neither would define the whole. The returnees who did go back to Jerusalem faced enormous difficulties. The city was in ruins. The surrounding population had not been deported and had developed its own social structures and religious practices during the exile. The returning elite clashed with the people who had remained. The rebuilding of the temple, completed around 516 BCE, what is now called the Second Temple, was a political as much as a religious act, and the community that emerged from this reconstruction was different from the one that had entered exile. It was more self-consciously defined by text, by law, by the boundaries of communal practice. The reforms associated with Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE, strict Sabbath observance, dietary laws, endogamy, public reading of the Torah, were not simply religious conservatism. They were identity preservation technology, in a world where the temptation and pressure to assimilate into the surrounding Hellenistic and Persian cultures was constant and real. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE introduced a new and more seductive threat than military conquest: cultural prestige. Greek culture, its philosophy, its art, its language, its athletic culture, its political ideals, was genuinely attractive to educated elites across the ancient world. The process historians call Hellenization swept through the Eastern Mediterranean with remarkable speed. Jewish communities were not immune. Greek became the language of educated Jews across the diaspora. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, the Septuagint in Alexandria, where a large and sophisticated Jewish community had established itself. Jewish philosophers attempted to synthesize Greek philosophy with Jewish theology. Some Jewish aristocrats in Jerusalem built a gymnasium, adopted Greek names, and sought to transform Jerusalem into a Greek-style polis. The tension between Hellenization and traditional practice reached a crisis point in 167 BCE, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, ruling the Syrian successor state to Alexander's empire, attempted to forcibly suppress Jewish religious practice. The temple was desecrated, Torah scrolls were burned, and observance of the Sabbath and dietary laws was prohibited under penalty of death. The response was the Maccabean revolt, led by the priestly Hasmonean family. After roughly 3 years of guerrilla warfare, the rebels recaptured Jerusalem and rededicated the temple, the event commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. The Maccabean revolt is often presented as a straightforward story of religious freedom against tyranny. The historical reality is considerably more complicated. The conflict was also a civil war within the Jewish community, between those who embraced Hellenization and those who resisted it. The Hasmoneans, who led the revolt, were themselves a priestly family who subsequently adopted many Hellenistic practices once they came to power, including Greek titles and political styles. The story of Hanukkah, in other words, is partly a story about the internal Jewish debate over what it meant to maintain a distinct identity in a cosmopolitan world, a debate that has never fully been resolved. The Hasmonean dynasty ruled an independent Jewish state for roughly a century, until the Roman general Pompey arrived in 63 BCE and incorporated Judea into the Roman sphere. What followed was a period of complex, often violent, and ultimately catastrophic interaction between Jewish society and Roman power. Roman rule over Judea was mediated through a series of client kings and governors, the most famous of whom was Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 to 4 BCE. Herod is a figure of genuine historical complexity. He was politically shrewd, architecturally ambitious, and personally brutal. He expanded the temple in Jerusalem into one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. The platform his builders constructed still stands today, and its western retaining wall is what Jews call the Western Wall. He also murdered members of his own family when he suspected them of disloyalty. He was deeply unpopular among many Jews who regarded him as a Roman puppet of questionable Jewish lineage. And yet the grandeur of his temple expansion deepened the emotional and religious centrality of Jerusalem in Jewish life, making what came next even more devastating. The 1st century CE was a period of intense messianic expectation, political tension, and social unrest in Judea. Multiple movements, sects, and would-be redeemers competed for followers. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. These were not simply theological schools. They were competing visions of how Jewish society should be organized, how to relate to Roman power, and what the future held. It was in this environment that Jesus of Nazareth preached, was executed by Roman crucifixion, and, according to his followers, rose from the dead. The movement that emerged from his death would eventually become Christianity, transforming the entire Western world. But that transformation lay in the future. In the immediate context of 1st century Judea, it was one of many competing Jewish movements in a deeply unstable society. The instability reached its breaking point in 66 CE, when a Jewish revolt against Roman rule began in Judea. The causes were multiple: Roman administrative abuses, the provocative behavior of the procurator Gessius Florus, deep economic inequality, the radicalization of the Zealot movement, and the messianic conviction among some groups that God would intervene to deliver them. The Roman response was overwhelming. The emperor Vespasian sent his son Titus with a massive army. After a prolonged siege, Jerusalem fell in 70 CE. The temple, Herod's magnificent temple, the spiritual center of Jewish life, was burned to the ground. The destruction was total. The Arch of Titus in Rome still shows Roman soldiers carrying the temple's menorah in triumph. The historian Josephus, who witnessed the destruction, described scenes of horror that are difficult to read even 2,000 years later. The exact death toll is uncertain and disputed. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers. But what is clear is that the human cost was catastrophic, and yet this was not quite the end of Jewish political resistance. A final revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, was crushed by the Emperor Hadrian with even more comprehensive destruction. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, from which Jews were banned. The province was renamed Syria Palestina, a name derived from the Philistines, a deliberate act of historical erasure. Hadrian's intent was apparently to sever the Jewish connection to the land entirely. It did not work, but it came closer than is sometimes acknowledged. What saved Jewish identity after 70 CE was not military resistance, not political maneuvering, and not divine intervention in any form that historians can assess. It was an institutional innovation that had been developing for centuries and now became the primary vehicle of Jewish life, the rabbinic movement. The rabbis, teachers, interpreters, legal scholars had their roots in the Pharisaic movement of the Second Temple period. After the temple's destruction, they moved to the center of Jewish communal life with a radical and practical answer to the central question: how do you maintain a religion built around a temple when the temple no longer exists? The rabbinic answer was to transfer the sacred functions of the temple into the life of the community and the home. Prayer replaced sacrifice. The synagogue replaced the temple as the center of communal worship. The study of Torah became itself a sacred act, not merely preparation for religious life, but the essence of it. The rabbi, a teacher and legal interpreter, not a priest, replaced the Kohen as the central religious authority. The Sabbath table in a family home was described as an altar. The family meal took on quasi-sacrificial significance. The entire architecture of Jewish life was redesigned to function without the one thing it had always centered on. This was not an obvious or inevitable development. It required enormous intellectual creativity, institutional discipline, and communal willingness to accept a radically transformed religious life. And it was carried out primarily through a process of legal debate, interpretation, and codification that produced one of the most remarkable intellectual documents in human history, the Talmud. The Talmud, compiled in two major versions, the Jerusalem Talmud in roughly the 4th century CE and the Babylonian Talmud completed around the 6th or 7th century CE, is not a simple legal code. It is a record of centuries of rabbinic debate, argument, counter-argument, story, legal ruling, ethical reflection, and interpretive creativity. It preserves minority opinions alongside majority rulings. It records the names of the scholars who disagreed. It is, in a sense, an institutionalization of argument, a document that teaches its readers not just what to do, but how to think about what to do and why. The Babylonian Talmud in particular became the central intellectual and legal authority for Jewish communities across the diaspora, providing a common framework that could be applied in Baghdad, in Rome, in the Rhine Valley, in Toledo, in Cairo. Wherever Jews lived, the Talmud traveled with them. The geographic spread of Jewish communities by late antiquity was remarkable. There were significant Jewish populations in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in North Africa, in Italy, in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Persia, and along the trade routes of the ancient world. These communities were not isolated from each other. They maintained contact through letters, through the movement of scholars, through commercial networks, and through a shared textual tradition. The Babylonian Jewish community, the descendants of those who had chosen to remain after Cyrus's decree, became particularly important, housing the great academies at Sura and Pumbedita that produced the Babylonian Talmud and served as the intellectual center of world Jewry for centuries. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE transformed the map of the Jewish world dramatically. Within a century of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Arab armies had conquered the entire Middle East, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. Suddenly, the vast majority of the world's Jewish population lived under Muslim rule. The Islamic legal framework classified Jews, along with Christians, as dhimmis, protected peoples who were tolerated but subject to specific restrictions and taxes. The reality of Jewish life under Islam varied enormously by time and place. In some periods and locations, it was genuinely tolerant and even flourishing. In others, it was restrictive and occasionally violent. The idea of a golden age of Jewish-Muslim coexistence is a partial truth. There were periods of genuine cultural collaboration and intellectual exchange, particularly in Abbasid Baghdad and in medieval Andalusia, but it is also, in part, a later construction shaped by the desire for a usable past. The period of Andalusian Jewish culture, roughly the 10th through 12th centuries in Islamic Spain, does represent a genuine high point of Jewish intellectual and cultural achievement within a broader Islamic civilization. Figures like Samuel Han-Nagid, who served as a military commander and vizier in the Granada Emirate, or Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, who became the greatest Jewish philosopher and legal codifier of the medieval period, emerged from this world of cross-cultural intellectual exchange. Maimonides' life itself illustrates the complexity of the period. Born in Córdoba in 1135, he was forced to flee when the Almohad dynasty, a puritanical Berber Islamic movement, conquered the city and gave its non-Muslim population the choice of conversion, exile, or death. He eventually settled in Cairo, where he served as court physician to Saladin's vizier and wrote his monumental works of philosophy and Jewish law. The Almohad persecution is a reminder that the Islamic world was not uniformly hospitable to Jewish life. But even in its worst periods, the situation of Jews under Islamic rule was generally less catastrophic than what developed in Christian Europe. The history of Jews in medieval Christian Europe is one of the most painful and consequential chapters of the entire Jewish story. The theological framework of medieval Christianity positioned Jews in a deeply ambiguous and ultimately dangerous role. They were witnesses to the truth of Christianity through their scriptures, but they were also held collectively responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, a charge, the deicide accusation, that had no basis in careful theological reasoning but enormous power in popular religious culture. Jews were permitted to exist in Christian Europe, but they were progressively restricted, segregated, taxed, and periodically subjected to organized violence. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, inaugurated a new era of anti-Jewish violence in Europe. As crusading armies moved through the Rhine Valley toward the Holy Land, they attacked Jewish communities in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer with devastating effect. The theological logic was explicit. Why travel to fight the enemies of Christ in Jerusalem when the enemies of Christ were living among you? Thousands of Jews were killed in what historians call the Rhineland massacres. Many others chose death over forced conversion. The communities that survived rebuilt, but the psychological and demographic damage was immense. The following centuries brought a cascade of restrictions and expulsions. Jews were required to wear distinctive clothing or badges in many European countries. They were confined to specific neighborhoods. The ghetto, a term that originates from the Jewish quarter of Venice established in 1516, though the practice of forced Jewish segregation was much older. They were barred from most professions, which pushed them into moneylending, then prohibited for Christians by the church, creating the economic stereotype that was then used to justify further persecution. They were accused of ritual murder, the blood libel, a completely fabricated charge that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, and these accusations led to executions and pogroms across Europe from the 12th century onward. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 produced a new wave of violence. As the plague killed roughly a third of Europe's population, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. The accusation was absurd. Jews died from the plague at comparable rates to their neighbors, but it was widely believed and acted upon. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in Germany, France, and the Low Countries. In 1290, England expelled its Jewish population entirely. France followed in 1306 and again in 1394. The expulsions accumulated, pushing Jewish populations eastward into Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire, which welcomed Jewish refugees with varying degrees of genuine hospitality and strategic calculation. The largest and most consequential expulsion came in 1492, when the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from completing the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews who refused baptism to leave Spain within 4 months. The Sephardic Jewish community of Spain, one of the most cultured, prosperous, and intellectually distinguished Jewish communities in the world, was expelled. Historians estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people were forced to leave, though the precise numbers are debated. They carried with them their language, Ladino, a form of medieval Spanish written in Hebrew script, their customs, their liturgy, and their memory of Sepharad, the Hebrew name for Spain. Sephardic communities established themselves in the Ottoman Empire, in North Africa, in the Netherlands, and eventually in the Americas. 500 years later, Sephardic Jews in Istanbul and Thessaloniki were still speaking a form of 15th century Spanish. The Ottoman Empire's reception of Sephardic refugees was not purely humanitarian. The empire gained skilled craftsmen, merchants, physicians, and administrators, but it was genuinely more tolerant than what the refugees had fled. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, too, reportedly remarked that Ferdinand of Spain had impoverished his own kingdom by expelling people who enriched others. While Sephardic communities rebuilt in the Ottoman world, Ashkenazic Jewish communities, those of Central and Eastern Europe, were undergoing their own transformation. Pushed eastward by expulsions and violence, large Ashkenazic populations settled in Poland and Lithuania, where a series of royal charters granted them relatively substantial autonomy. The Council of Four Lands, the Vaad Arba Aratsot, functioned as a quasi-governmental body for Polish Jewry from the 16th to the 18th century, collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, and representing the Jewish community to the Polish crown. It was in effect a government without a territory, an institutional form of self-governance that had no precedent in European political history. The 17th century brought catastrophe to Eastern European Jewry in the form of the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648 to 1657. Cossack uprisings led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky against Polish rule resulted in the massacre of Jewish communities across Ukraine and Poland on a scale that shocked contemporaries. Estimates of Jewish deaths range from tens of thousands to over 100,000. The uncertainty itself reflects how chaotic and comprehensive the destruction was. The psychological impact was enormous. It shook the confidence of Jewish communities in the stability of even their most established diaspora homes. It was in this atmosphere of trauma and messianic longing that the most consequential false messiah in Jewish history emerged. In 1665, a charismatic and psychologically volatile rabbi named Shabbatai Zivi, from Smyrna in the Ottoman Empire, was proclaimed the Messiah by the influential Nathan of Gaza. The announcement spread through Jewish communities with extraordinary speed, producing a wave of messianic fervor that swept from Amsterdam to Yemen, from Poland to Morocco. Communities sold their possessions in anticipation of the imminent redemption. Merchants abandoned their businesses. People fasted and prayed and wept with joy. In 1666, the Ottoman Sultan summoned Shabbatai Zivi to Constantinople and gave him a stark choice: convert to Islam or face execution. Shabbatai Zivi converted. The messianic movement collapsed overnight, leaving communities across the Jewish world in a state of shock, humiliation, and profound theological crisis. Some followers refused to accept that the conversion invalidated the messianic claim and developed elaborate theological explanations for why the Messiah had to descend into apostasy. These followers, the Sabbatians, persisted as a secret movement for generations. But for the majority of Jews, the Shabbatai Zivi episode was a shattering experience that deepened skepticism toward charismatic messianic claims and reinforced the authority of traditional rabbinic leadership. The 18th century brought a different kind of revolution, the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment created a new set of possibilities and dangers for Jewish life that were in many ways more complex than anything that had come before. The core promise of Enlightenment thought was universal human reason. If all human beings were fundamentally rational, then the distinctions between peoples based on religion, custom, and birth were irrational prejudices that an enlightened society should overcome. For Jews, this promise was simultaneously liberating and demanding. The price of inclusion in the new rational order was, in many formulations, the abandonment of Jewish particularity. The Enlightenment philosopher Christian Wilhelm von Dohm argued in 1781 for the civil emancipation of Jews, but on the condition that they become more like their neighbors, shedding what he saw as the distorting effects of centuries of persecution and religious isolation. The Jewish response to the Enlightenment was not uniform. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, produced a movement of Jewish intellectuals who sought to integrate secular education, European languages, and Enlightenment rationalism into Jewish life while maintaining Jewish identity. Figures like Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin became celebrated in both Jewish and German intellectual circles, arguing that one could be both a good Jew and a good citizen of a European state. Mendelssohn's own children, however, converted to Christianity, a fact that illustrates the difficulty of the balance he sought to maintain. The French Revolution of 1789 produced the first formal emancipation of Jews in a major European state, granting full citizenship rights to French Jews in 1791. The Napoleonic conquests spread this emancipation across much of Europe, and even where Napoleon's armies did not reach, the pressure for Jewish emancipation became a major political question throughout the 19th century. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and eventually Russia all grappled with the question of what to do with their Jewish populations in an age of nationalism and citizenship. The problem was that nationalism created a new and particularly insidious form of exclusion. If the nation was defined by shared language, shared culture, shared blood, as many 19th century nationalist movements insisted, then Jews, no matter how assimilated, remained outsiders. The more Jews assimilated, the more threatening their assimilation seemed to those who defined national identity in ethnic terms. This paradox, that assimilation did not produce acceptance, but instead a new form of anxiety and hostility, is one of the most important and tragic dynamics in modern Jewish history. The term anti-Semitism itself was coined in 1879 by a German journalist named Wilhelm Marr, who used it to describe what he presented as a racial rather than religious hostility to Jews. This linguistic shift was significant. Medieval Jew hatred had been primarily religious in character. Jews could, in principle, escape persecution by converting. Racial anti-Semitism removed that escape route. If the problem with Jews was their blood rather than their beliefs, conversion was irrelevant. This was the ideological framework that would eventually make the Holocaust possible. But before arriving at that catastrophe, it is important to understand the other major Jewish response to the crisis of modernity: Zionism. The Zionist movement, which emerged in the late 19th century, argued that the Jewish problem, the persistent insecurity and persecution of Jewish communities in diaspora, could not be solved by assimilation, emancipation, or religious reform. It could only be solved by the creation of a Jewish political state. The founder of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was an assimilated Viennese journalist who was radicalized by the Dreyfus Affair, the 1894 trial of a French Jewish army officer falsely convicted of treason in a case that exposed the depth of anti-Semitism in supposedly enlightened France. Herzl's conclusion was stark. If even France, the birthplace of Jewish emancipation, could not protect its Jews, then emancipation was a failed project. Jews needed their own state. Zionism was not the only Jewish response to modernity. The Bund, the General Jewish Labor Bund, argued for socialist solidarity and Jewish cultural autonomy within a transformed European society. Reform Judaism sought to modernize Jewish religious practice to make it compatible with European bourgeois life. Orthodox Judaism insisted on the authority of traditional law and resisted both Zionism and reform as dangerous departures from the covenant. The debates between these movements were fierce, sometimes bitter, and reflected genuine disagreements about the nature of Jewish identity and the path to Jewish security. Meanwhile, in the Russian Empire, which controlled the largest Jewish population in the world, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Pale of Settlement, a vast region in western Russia and eastern Poland, where Jews were legally required to live, housed millions of people in conditions of poverty, legal restriction, and periodic violent attack. The pogroms, organized attacks on Jewish communities, intensified after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, when Jews were falsely implicated in the conspiracy. Waves of emigration followed. Between 1880 and 1924, roughly 2 million Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe to the United States, transforming American Jewish life and creating the largest and most influential diaspora community in history. The First World War reshuffled the political map of Europe in ways that had enormous consequences for Jewish communities. The collapse of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires created new states with new Jewish populations and new forms of instability. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, gave Zionism its first major diplomatic victory, though the declaration was deliberately ambiguous about what a national home meant and carefully qualified by the statement that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The interwar period brought rising fascism, economic depression, and the intensification of anti-Semitism across Europe. In Germany, the National Socialist movement under Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 on a platform that included, as a central element, a virulent racial anti-Semitism. The persecution of German Jews escalated progressively: legal exclusion, economic expropriation, social humiliation, forced emigration, and finally, after the beginning of the Second World War, systematic mass murder. The Holocaust, the Shoah, resulted in the murder of approximately 6 million Jews, roughly 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. The scale, the deliberateness, and the industrial organization of the genocide placed it in a category of historical crime that has no precise parallel. The Holocaust destroyed communities that had existed for centuries. The Jewish communities of Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Netherlands, France, Greece, Hungary, communities with their own languages, their own literary traditions, their own religious schools, their own distinctive customs were annihilated. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, which had produced a rich and distinctive culture over 5 centuries, was essentially destroyed in 4 years. The loss was not only of lives, but of an entire civilization. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, was shaped by the catastrophe in ways that are impossible to fully separate. The Zionist project had been developing for decades before the Holocaust, but the murder of 6 million Jews transformed the political context of Jewish statehood in ways that made it both more urgent and more complicated. The War of Israeli Independence, what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs, creating a new refugee crisis and a new set of historical grievances that remain unresolved to this day. The history of Israel and Palestine is one of the most contested and politically charged historical questions in the contemporary world, and it cannot be responsibly summarized in a few sentences. What can be said is that the creation of Israel represented the first time in roughly 2,000 years that a Jewish political sovereignty existed in the ancient homeland, and that its creation was simultaneously a fulfillment of an ancient aspiration and the beginning of a new set of conflicts. The Jewish world after 1948 was organized around 2 major poles, Israel and the United States. The American Jewish community, which had grown enormously through the waves of immigration from Eastern Europe, became the largest and most influential diaspora community in history. It was also the most integrated into a host society that any Jewish community had ever experienced, not because anti-Semitism disappeared in America, but because the American constitutional framework and the particular dynamics of American pluralism created conditions in which Jewish integration was possible without the complete abandonment of Jewish identity. American Jews built universities, entered the professions, participated in politics, created literature and art, and maintained Jewish communal institutions, all simultaneously. The question of how to balance integration and distinctiveness, which had haunted Jewish communities since the Babylonian exile, took new forms in the American context. But it did not go away. The Soviet Union, which had inherited the largest Jewish population in the world from the Russian Empire, presented a different situation. Soviet ideology was officially atheist and anti-nationalist, which meant that Jewish religious practice and Zionist activity were both suppressed. Soviet Jews were simultaneously subject to discrimination in certain fields and expected to abandon their Jewish identity. The Soviet Jewish experience produced its own distinctive forms of Jewish consciousness, including the Refusenik movement, Jews who applied to emigrate to Israel and were refused, often losing their jobs and facing harassment as a result. The emigration of Soviet Jews after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought over 1 million people to Israel and hundreds of thousands to the United States, reshaping both communities. What does it mean to sustain an identity across 25 centuries of exile, persecution, dispersion, and transformation? The question is not rhetorical. It points to something genuinely unusual in human history that deserves serious analysis. Several mechanisms stand out. The first and most fundamental is the text. The Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, the legal codes, the liturgy. These created a shared intellectual and spiritual world that transcended geography. A Jew in Baghdad and a Jew in Toledo in the year 1000 CE would have prayed the same prayers, observed the same holidays, read from the same Torah portions, and debated the same legal questions. The text was the homeland. The second mechanism is the calendar. The Jewish calendar is not simply a system of timekeeping. It is a structured annual cycle of memory, mourning, celebration, and aspiration that kept the community oriented toward a shared past and a shared future. The fast of Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of both temples, kept the memory of loss alive across generations. The Passover Seder, with its explicit instruction that every person in every generation must see themselves as if they personally had gone out of Egypt, created an identification with collective history that was renewed every year in every home. The calendar was a machine for producing and reproducing collective memory. The third mechanism is the community structure. Wherever Jews settled, they established communal institutions: the synagogue, the school, the cemetery, the charitable society, the court. These institutions provided mutual support, enforced communal norms, and created the social infrastructure of a distinct community within the larger society. They also created networks of connection between communities through the movement of scholars, through commercial relationships, through the circulation of legal responsa, the written answers to legal questions that rabbis sent to each other across vast distances. The fourth mechanism, and perhaps the most psychologically complex, is the theology of exile itself. Rabbinic Judaism developed a sophisticated theological framework in which exile was not simply a political misfortune, but a condition with religious meaning. The divine presence, the Shekinah, was understood to be in exile along with the Jewish people. The restoration of the Jewish people to their land was linked to the redemption of the entire world. This framework gave exile a dignity and a purpose that made it psychologically sustainable across generations. It also created a powerful tension. The desire for redemption was real and urgent, but the tradition also warned against forcing the end, against human attempts to bring about the Messianic age through political action. This tension between aspiration and patience, between the longing for return and the acceptance of exile, runs through centuries of Jewish thought. The fifth mechanism is the very diversity of the diaspora itself. Because Jewish communities existed in so many different political environments, no single catastrophe could destroy them all. When Spanish Jews were expelled in 1492, Ottoman Jews were flourishing. When German Jews were being murdered in the 20th century, American Jews were building institutions. The dispersion that seemed like a vulnerability was also a form of redundancy, a distributed system that was harder to destroy than any centralized structure would have been. This is not to romanticize the diaspora. The costs were real and enormous. The violence was real. The humiliation was real. The psychological burden of living as a minority, subject to the goodwill of rulers who could revoke that goodwill at any moment, was real. The internal divisions, the communal conflicts, the debates about identity and authenticity that never fully resolved, these were real. The Jewish story is not a triumphalist narrative of survival against the odds. It is a story of human beings making the best of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, often failing, often suffering, sometimes achieving remarkable things, and never quite disappearing. The question of what Jewish identity actually is, what holds it together, what defines membership, what the relationship is between religion, ethnicity, culture, and nationhood has never been fully settled. It was contested in the ancient world. It was contested in the medieval world, and it is contested today. Is Jewishness a religion, an ethnicity, a civilization, a nation? Different communities in different periods have emphasized different answers, and the tension between these answers has been a source of both internal conflict and extraordinary creativity. The very fact that the question cannot be simply answered is itself historically significant. It suggests that Jewish identity has always been more complex, more contested, and more dynamic than any simple definition can capture. The modern state of Israel, which defines itself as a Jewish state, has had to grapple with this question in political and legal terms, with results that remain deeply contested both within Israel and in the broader Jewish world. Who is a Jew for the purposes of immigration law? What does it mean for a state to be simultaneously Jewish and democratic? How should Israel relate to the diaspora communities whose relationship to Israel is one of solidarity, but not citizenship? These are not abstract questions. They are the contemporary form of debates that have been going on for 2,500 years. The archaeological record of the ancient world continues to complicate and enrich our understanding of Jewish origins and early history. The relationship between the biblical narrative and the archaeological evidence is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Archaeologists have found evidence that challenges some traditional chronologies and confirms others. The picture that emerges is of a people whose identity was shaped by a complex interaction between historical experience, theological interpretation, and literary creativity, and that this interaction was not a distortion of some purer original identity, but was itself the process by which the identity was formed. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls beginning in 1947, roughly 2,000 years after they were hidden in caves near the Dead Sea by a Jewish sect, most likely the Essenes, provided an extraordinary window into the diversity of Jewish thought and practice in the Second Temple period. The scrolls showed a Judaism that was more varied, more contested, and more intellectually dynamic than the later rabbinic tradition sometimes suggested. They also confirmed the remarkable antiquity and textual stability of the Hebrew scriptures. The memory of the Holocaust has become a central element of both Jewish and global historical consciousness in the decades since the Second World War. The establishment of Yad Vashem in Israel, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and hundreds of memorials and educational institutions around the world reflects a collective decision to make the memory of the genocide a permanent part of human historical consciousness. The phrase "never again," simple, urgent, and politically contested in its application, has become one of the most widely invoked moral commitments of the post-war world. Whether that commitment has been honored, and what it demands in practice, remains one of the most difficult questions in contemporary ethics and politics. What the Jewish story ultimately reveals is something important about how human communities actually work. We tend to think of nations and peoples as defined by the things that are most visible: territory, political power, military strength, institutional continuity. The Jewish story suggests that these things, while important, are not the deepest foundations of collective identity. The deepest foundations are shared memory, shared text, shared practice, and the willingness to argue fiercely, endlessly, productively about what all of these mean. The rabbis preserved a tradition that God created human beings from a single ancestor so that no one could say to another, "My ancestor is greater than yours." They also preserved the tradition that the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred between Jews. These two ideas, held in tension, capture something essential about the Jewish historical experience: the aspiration to universal dignity and the recurring failure to live up to it even within the community itself. The Jewish people did not survive because they were uniquely virtuous, uniquely chosen, or uniquely lucky. They survived because they built institutions that could function without a state, developed a theology that could survive without a temple, maintained networks that could function across vast distances, and preserved a tradition of argument that kept the community intellectually alive even in the worst circumstances. They survived because, when everything external was taken away, they had built something internal that could not be taken. Every empire that tried to erase them is gone. The text remains. the argument continues that continuity, imperfect, contested, costly, and extraordinary, is worth understanding, not because the Jewish story is the only story of survival and resilience in human history, but because it is one of the most thoroughly documented, and because the mechanisms it reveals have implications far beyond any single people or any single tradition. If this kind of history, the kind that gets underneath the surface of events and asks why things really happened, is what you come here for, subscribe and leave a comment below. What do you think is the most underappreciated turning point in this story? The Babylonian exile, the rabbinic revolution after 70 CE, the 1492 expulsion. The argument is worth having. And if you want to go deeper into the world of the ancient Near East, the next video on the rise and fall of Babylon itself is waiting for you. The story of Jewish survival is also, inescapably, a story about language, and the linguistic history of the Jewish people is one of the most remarkable and revealing threads running through the entire narrative. Hebrew, the language of the biblical text, ceased to be a widely spoken vernacular sometime around the 5th or 4th century BCE, replaced in daily life first by Aramaic, and later by Greek, Arabic, Ladino, Yiddish, and the languages of whatever country Jews inhabited. For roughly 2,000 years, Hebrew survived primarily as a language of prayer, study, and sacred text, kept alive not by daily conversation, but by the daily discipline of religious practice. Every morning prayer, every Torah reading, every legal debate in the Talmud, kept the language present in the minds of educated Jews, even when no one was using it to buy bread or argue with a neighbor. Then, in the late 19th century, a Lithuanian Jewish intellectual named Eliezer ben Yehuda made a decision that most serious linguists at the time considered either visionary or delusional. He would revive Hebrew as a living spoken language. Ben Yehuda moved to Palestine in 1881, insisted on speaking only Hebrew in his home, raised his son as the first native Hebrew speaker in modern history, and spent decades compiling a comprehensive dictionary of the Hebrew language, inventing new words for concepts that had not existed in biblical times: newspaper, dictionary, towel, dictionary, ice cream. The revival of Hebrew as a vernacular was not inevitable. It was a deliberate, contested, and ultimately successful act of cultural will. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, Hebrew became its official language, the only successful example in recorded history of a language that had ceased to be spoken in daily life being fully restored as a living vernacular. This linguistic revival was not simply a cultural curiosity. It was an act of identity consolidation on a massive scale. It gave Jewish immigrants from dozens of different countries, speaking Yiddish, Ladino, Arabic, Russian, Polish, Romanian, German, a common language that was simultaneously ancient and new, connecting them to the biblical past while building something genuinely modern. The tensions this created were real. Yiddish speakers resisted the displacement of their language, and the cultural world that Yiddish represented was enormous and irreplaceable. But the success of Hebrew revival demonstrated once again the capacity of Jewish communities to make radical institutional innovations when survival demanded it. The relationship between Jewish communities and the written word extended far beyond religious texts. Jewish engagement with literacy, scholarship, and intellectual life across the centuries produced an extraordinary concentration of intellectual achievement that is difficult to explain without reference to the community's structural emphasis on learning. The tradition that every Jewish man, and in many communities, every Jewish child, should be literate enough to read the Torah created literacy rates in Jewish communities that were dramatically higher than in surrounding populations for most of the medieval and early modern period. This was not accidental. It was the direct consequence of a religious obligation that required reading. When the barriers to Jewish participation in European intellectual and professional life began to fall in the 19th century, the results were striking. In the century between roughly 1850 and 1950, Jewish individuals made contributions to mathematics, physics, medicine, economics, literature, music, and philosophy that were disproportionate to their numbers by any reasonable measure. Figures like Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Franz Kafka, Marcel Proust, Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and dozens of others emerged from Jewish backgrounds, though their relationships to Jewish identity varied enormously, from deep engagement to near-complete rejection. The concentration of achievement was real, and it reflected centuries of communal investment in literacy and learning, suddenly unleashed into a wider world that had previously been closed. This concentration of achievement also fed the paranoid fantasies of anti-Semites, who interpreted Jewish success in modern professions as evidence of conspiracy rather than as the predictable result of historical circumstance. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated document purporting to describe a Jewish plan for world domination, produced by the Russian secret police around 1903, was exposed as a forgery almost immediately by serious journalists. Yet it circulated widely across Europe and the Arab world throughout the 20th century and continues to circulate online today. The persistence of this particular lie is itself historically instructive. It reveals how the mechanisms of anti-Semitism adapted to new contexts while maintaining their essential structure. The 20th century also produced something that no previous century had managed, a serious, sustained, and partially successful effort by Jewish communities themselves to document, analyze, and transmit their own history on their own terms. The founding of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in Vilna in 1925, later relocated to New York after the Holocaust, represented a commitment to treating Jewish history and culture as subjects worthy of rigorous scholarly investigation. The development of Jewish studies as an academic discipline in universities around the world in the second half of the 20th century brought the tools of modern historical, archaeological, and literary scholarship to bear on a tradition that had previously been studied primarily from within, by religious scholars whose primary commitment was to the tradition rather than to historical reconstruction. This scholarly tradition has produced genuine revisions to the received narrative. Archaeological work in Israel and across the Middle East has complicated the biblical chronology in important ways. Genetic research has provided new data about the biological relationships between Jewish communities that both confirms and complicates traditional accounts of shared ancestry. Historians have recovered the voices of ordinary Jewish men and women, not just the rabbis and the scholars and the wealthy merchants, but the artisans, the peddlers, the women who ran households and sometimes businesses, the children who grew up in poverty in the Pale of Settlement, through the patient work of archival research and oral history collection. What emerges from this scholarship is a picture of Jewish history that is richer, more complicated, and more human than either the traditional religious narrative or the anti-Semitic caricature. It is a history of real people making real decisions under real constraints, sometimes with great courage and wisdom, sometimes with pettiness and failure, always within a tradition that gave their lives a framework of meaning even when, especially when, that meaning was hard to find. The question of memory itself occupies a central place in Jewish intellectual and cultural life in ways that are historically unusual. The Hebrew word zachor, remember, appears in the biblical text hundreds of times as a command, not merely a suggestion. The obligation to remember, to keep the past alive not as nostalgia but as moral instruction, is built into the structure of Jewish religious practice in a way that has no precise parallel in other traditions. The historian Yosef Haim Yerushalmi, in his landmark 1982 study Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, argued that the Jewish tradition had actually been somewhat ambivalent about history in the modern sense, the careful, critical reconstruction of the past, because its primary concern was not historical accuracy, but the transmission of collective memory with moral force. The rise of modern Jewish historiography represented, in his reading, a kind of rupture with this older tradition of memory, a substitution of historical consciousness for religious memory. Whether or not one accepts Yerushalmi's full argument, the tension he identifies is real and important. The Jewish community has always had to negotiate between the demands of memory and the demands of the present, between fidelity to the past and the necessity of adaptation. Every generation has had to decide which elements of the tradition were essential and which were contingent, which practices were the core of Jewish identity and which were the accidental products of particular historical circumstances. These decisions were never made in a vacuum. They were made under pressure, the pressure of persecution, of assimilation, of modernity, of war, of prosperity, and they were made always in argument. The argument continues today. The Jewish world of the 21st century is more diverse, more geographically dispersed, more internally divided, and in many ways more secure than at any previous point in history. It is also facing challenges that are genuinely new, the challenge of maintaining Jewish identity in conditions of complete freedom and acceptance, where the external pressures that historically reinforced communal boundaries have largely disappeared in Western liberal democracies. The intermarriage rate among American Jews has risen dramatically over the past half-century. The question of who counts as Jewish and what Jewish identity requires in practice is more contested than ever. The relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel is more complicated and more fraught than it was in the decades immediately following the Holocaust and the founding of the state. None of these challenges are unprecedented in their underlying structure, even if their specific forms are new. The Jewish community has always had to figure out how to maintain its identity in conditions that were not designed for it. The conditions change. The question remains what the full sweep of this history suggests, from the Babylonian exile to the Rabbinic Revolution, from the Golden Age of Andalusia to the catastrophe of the Holocaust, from the revival of Hebrew to the founding of Israel, to the flourishing of diaspora communities around the world, is that the survival of the Jewish people was never guaranteed, never automatic, and never without cost. It was the result of specific choices, specific institutions, specific intellectual and spiritual commitments that were renewed in every generation. The people who made those choices were not mythological figures. They were human beings who were frightened, uncertain, sometimes brilliant, sometimes foolish, and always aware that what they did or failed to do would matter to the people who came after them. The empires are gone, the people remain, and the questions they have been asking about identity, memory, justice, obligation, and what it means to maintain a covenant with the past are questions that belong to everyone. If this kind of history moves you, the kind that takes a people seriously enough to show both their suffering and their agency, their failures and their achievements, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who ought to know this story. Leave a comment telling us which moment in this narrative you think deserves a full video of its own. And if you want to follow one of the threads we touched on today, the story of the Babylonian exile and the world that produced it is the next place to go.